think that's the most fateful decision in Israel's history. Once you've decided on expansion rather than security, it follows you're going to have perpetual conflict, and it also follows that they're going to have to rely on superpower protection. So that's when the definitive reliance of Israel on the United States began. The crucial question at that time was, how's the United States going to react? That's always the crucial question in international affairs because of its power, and crucially in this case. There was a debate. There was an internal debate in Washington. The State Department was in favor of accepting Sadat's offer, which in fact was pretty much in line, almost entirely in line with official U.S. policy. Henry Kissinger was the national security advisor, and he was opposed to it. Chances are he was opposed to it because his prime enemy in the world was the State Department. The Russians were down somewhere below. He was desperately eager to take over the State Department, which he finally did. So William Rogers, Secretary of State, was his main enemy in the world. He writes about this in his memoirs, but what he says is so utterly ridiculous that it's almost inconceivable that he believed it. American scholarship is very kind. They avoid this huge scholarship about Kissinger. I can go into the details if you want. Actually, I used to use it in undergraduate classes at MIT, just reading the memoirs, but it was impossible. The students are just rolling on the floors. But his position was that he was in favor of what he called stalemate, meaning no negotiations, just force. Okay, so reject Sadat's offer. Well, he won out on the internal conflict. There was a stalemate. No rejection of Sadat's offer was rejected. Egypt made very clear that they were serious about it. Sadat kept announcing as loudly as he could, Yamit means war. If you're going to build in the Northeast Sinai, there's going to be a war. He expelled the Russian advisors to try to sort of show the Kissinger that, look, we really mean it. The United States and Israel simply disregarded him. It was a period of extreme triumphalism, particularly in Israel. They were very sorry about it later, but and in fact wrote about it. But if you look at the period, it was one of extreme triumphalism. The Arabs don't know which end of the gun to hold, we'll do what we like, and so on. Interesting book about it by an Israeli journalist, which I tried hard to get somebody in the United States to publish in English, but no hope. If you can read French, you can read it in French. I'm non-Capelia. It was basically triumphalist. We can disregard the Arabs. And Kissinger had the same view. He understood the mailed fist. He said, we got the force, they can't do anything. Well, they did something. In October 1973, there was a war, and Israel came very close to destruction. It was the worst moment in its history. At that point, they barely escaped, thanks to enormous U.S. aid at the end. At that point, the clouds lifted. Kissinger and the Israelis recognized that the Arabs know which end of the gun to hold. We can't simply regard them as Egypt as a basket case. So therefore, we better get involved in negotiations. And then starts Kissinger's famous shuttle diplomacy, the master negotiator, going up and back between Israel and Egypt. All of this is just farce. I mean, there was a proposal on the table already, but you had to make it look as if the United States was achieving a diplomatic settlement. Well, that's the way history is written. At Camp David, because the victors, the powerful, are the ones who write history, but you can find out the truth if you like. It's all quite open in the documentary record. There were meetings in Camp David in 1978 under Carter, where effectively Israel and Egypt accepted Sadat's 1971 offer. Now, an honest history would say that was a diplomatic catastrophe. They accepted the offer that they rejected in 1971 at the cost of a major war, came close to a nuclear war, virtual destruction of Israel, vast suffering, But finally, the United States and Israel accepted what they'd rejected in 1971. But it's called a diplomatic triumph because we write history to make what we do look wonderful. That's a principle of academic scholarship, if you really want to make it in the field. But the facts are quite plain. In fact, it's even worse than what I said. The agreement that President Carter and it was then Menachem Begin, Prime Minister, what they agreed to in 1978, 79, was actually worse from their point of view than what Sadat had offered in 1971. Because in the interim, in the 1970s, the issue of Palestinian rights had entered the international agenda. It hadn't been there in 1971. You look at the major diplomatic documents, like famous UN 242, there's nothing for the Palestinians. Sadat's offer, nothing. Jordan's offer the year later ignored the Palestinians. But by the mid-70s, that was not possible anymore. The Palestinian issue had come front and center. Palestinian rights were beginning to be recognized. And in fact, in January 1976, next crucially important date, also wiped out of history. Things that are important tend to get wiped out of history if they don't sound right. In January 1976, there was a resolution brought to the UN Security Council by the major Arab states, by Egypt, Syria, Jordan, so-called confrontation states. It called for a two-state settlement on the international border, essentially the international consensus. It included all of the crucial wording of UN 242. Those of you who know the history know that it's agreed on all sides that UN 242 is the basic document. It called for recognition of the rights of all states in the region to exist in peace and security within secure and recognized borders and other similar wording. All of that was incorporated in the January 1976 resolution. The one difference was that they now called for a Palestinian state in the occupied territories. That was the difference. And in the United States vetoed the resolution. When the U.S. vetoes a resolution, it's actually a double veto. One, it's not implemented. Two, it's eliminated from history. That's ideological power. That's what you go to universities to learn how to do. And it's not a joke, incidentally. But and not my original comment. Orwell talked about it many years earlier. But it's wiped out of history. The same thing happened in 1980 under Carter, similar resolution, same veto. But meanwhile, things didn't disappear on the ground. I won't run through the rest of it. And in 1978-79, the residue of that remained. So the agreement that Begin and Carter had to accept had some reference to Palestinian national rights, vague, unspecific reference, but at least something. Whereas Sadat's offer in 1971, the Jordanian offer a year later, said nothing. Palestinians had no rights, just refugees. Well, that's the diplomatic catastrophe of 1978, down in history as a diplomatic triumph. I won't run through the rest of the history, but if you want to look, it's quite interesting. Year after, since the Security Council was eliminated because of the U.S. vetoes, the issue moved to the General Assembly, and year after year there were resolutions at the General Assembly, with votes like 150 to 3 or something. Sometimes the United States picked up a Pacific island or some Central American state or something like that, but essentially universal. Incidentally, this is not the only case. This is the case on many issues. And those who are concerned about their own country, if you're American citizens, ought to be aware of this. So just to take an example in another part of the world, a couple of weeks ago, the General Assembly passed its annual resolution condemning the U.S. embargo on Cuba. This year, the vote was 190 to 2, the United States and Israel. The year before, it had been 189 to 3. The United States had Palau that year. If you go back occasionally, and votes on the occupied territories are approximately the same. Sometimes, for example, in 2008, there was a vote on control of arms sales, a General Assembly vote. A vote on that, I forget the high number, but there were 2 states in opposition. At that time, even Israel didn't go along with the United States. The only state that went along was Zimbabwe. Well, that's obviously unreportable. So if you check the record, you'll find nothing about it. But that happens pretty consistently. U.S. policy towards Israel is not that unusual. And it has to do with the policies of world domination, being the status of world domination. You've got a lot of people opposed to what you do. But in the case of Israel-Palestine, I'll keep to that, the votes are pretty much the same, straight through. That's the record of rejectionism that continues until today. Now, there have been a couple of breaks, and they're worth understanding, because they give you an indication of what can be done if a U.S. government was willing to join the world. That's the crucial issue, in my opinion. The one significant break was in January 2001. In the year 2000, there were negotiations at Camp David, famous negotiations. They broke down. The media and commentary blame it on the Palestinians. Clinton knew better, however. He was the president. He recognized that the U.S.-Israeli proposals at Camp David could not be accepted by any Palestinians. And in December of 2000, he revised them. He issued what he called his parameters for a settlement. The parameters were kind of vague, but they were more forthcoming. Then he, a couple of days later, he made a speech in which he said, both sides have accepted the parameters, both sides have reservations. They then met in Taba, Egypt, to try to iron out their reservations, high-level negotiators of Israel and Palestine. And we have a lot of information about that. Unfortunately, we have no information from the Palestinian side. That's a lack that goes way back. But we have a lot of information from a very respected international observer, the European Union observer, now Prime Minister of Spain, Martinos. He gave a lengthy account of it. He was present. And we have a ton of information from the Israeli side. A lot of it, unfortunately, is in Hebrew, but some is in English, and from other observers. And they coincide. The pictures coincide. They were coming very close to a solution. In fact, in their final press conference, around mid-January, the two sides had a joint press conference, and they stated that with a few more days, they might iron out everything. There were still some points of disagreement, not trivial ones, but the major issues there was at least a basis for settlement, something pretty close to settlement, and they thought they could go on to a full settlement. Well, at that point, the Israeli Prime Minister, Barak, terminated the negotiations prematurely, and that was the end of that, almost. That was the end of formal negotiations. But informal ones continued, again at a high level, high-level officials and figures on both sides. And they came out with a very detailed proposal. It's called the Geneva Accords, because it was presented publicly at Geneva in December 2003. And that dealt with lots of details. That was agreed by both sides. You can like it or not. I'm just describing what happened, whatever one's opinion is toward that agreement. Well, it was released in Geneva. It's in print. You can find it. It's in English. There's a lot of stuff about it. It was released in Geneva in December 2003. It was welcomed by most of the world. Government sent representatives and so on. Israel flatly rejected it. The United States disregarded it. So if you look at the commentary here, almost nothing. Maybe you find a small news item somewhere. Well, that's the double veto again. When the U.S. rejects something, it doesn't happen, and it's wiped out of history, except for people who want to understand history. For them, it's not wiped out.